Hey guys, tonight we begin with a handful of straw that costs 2 pennies. Not fresh straw, not clean straw, not even particularly dry straw, just mouldy, damp, foul-smelling straw that's been used by previous prisoners and then sold again to the next occupant. This is about manor prison cells in 17th century England, where every basic necessity required payment, where water cost money, where sleeping on the floor instead of bare stone required coins, where survival meant participating in an economy more brutal than anything outside the prison walls. It's about how the justice system quietly monetized suffering, and what that reveals about who justice actually served when punishment became profit.
Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about institutional cruelty, about how systems turn human needs into commodities, about the economics of captivity, and what that says about society's values, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments what aspect of historical justice systems fascinates or horrifies you most. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how punishment worked when nobody was pretending it was about rehabilitation. Now settle in and let's discover what happens when every shred of comfort requires payment you probably don't have.
The manor is Blackstone in Derbyshire, and the year is 1678. England is 3 decades past civil war, but still sorting out what justice means in a country that executed its king and then brought back the monarchy. Manor houses throughout the country serve multiple functions. They're homes, administrative centres, courts, and prisons. Because most criminal justice in England happens locally, at the manor level, under the jurisdiction of local lords who serve as magistrates. Which means most prisons are just rooms in manor houses, converted cellars or unused wings, spaces that weren't designed for incarceration but get used for it anyway.
Robert Ashford is 23 years old and has been in Blackstone Manor's prison cell for 6 days. He's accused of stealing 3 chickens from a neighbour's farm. He probably did it. He needed to eat and had no money, and the chickens were there. Stealing chickens isn't a capital crime, but it's enough to get you locked up while awaiting trial. And trials take time, weeks sometimes, months if the magistrate is busy with other matters. So Robert sits in a cell that's maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls, 1 small window too high to reach, and a heavy wooden door with an iron lock. He's not alone. There are 4 other men in the cell with him. One is awaiting trial for assault, another for debt, the third for vagrancy, which basically means being poor in a place where someone important didn't want poor people. The 4th has been convicted already and is serving a 3-month sentence for public drunkenness. The cell was designed for maybe 2 people. It's holding 5. Nobody seems concerned about this. Overcrowding is normal, expected. Just another feature of manor prison life. Robert has 3 pennies to his name. He thought that was enough to survive on until his trial. He was wrong. The first thing he learned upon entering the cell was that the floor is stone, and sleeping on bare stone is miserable, cold, hard, painful after even 1 night. But there's straw available, for a price. The jailer, a thick-necked man named Garrett, who manages the prison as a side job while also serving as the manor's stablemaster, sells straw by the handful. 2 pennies per handful. Enough to make a thin layer, maybe 2 feet square. Not enough to actually cushion you from the stone, but enough to make sleeping slightly less awful. Robert bought 1 handful of straw on his 2nd day. Spent 2 of his 3 remaining pennies on mouldy bedding that smells like horse piss and mould. The other prisoners found this hilarious. They've been here longer. They know that straw is a luxury Robert won't be able to maintain, that his 3 pennies were woefully inadequate for the economic reality of imprisonment.
that he's about to learn what happens when you can't afford the basic necessities of survival in a system that charges for everything.
Water is also not free. There's a bucket in the corner that gets refilled once per day. Clean water, supposedly. Robert drinks from it freely on his first 2 days, assuming that water, at least, is a basic right, even in prison. Wrong again. On the 3rd day, one of the other prisoners, Thomas, the man serving 3 months for drunkenness, and who seems to run the informal hierarchy in the cell, pulls Robert aside and explains the economy.
"Water's a penny per day," Thomas says. His tone is matter-of-fact, not threatening, just informative. "You've been drinking free for 2 days. That's debt. You owe me 2 pennies. "You don't own the water," Robert protests. "The jailer brings it."
"The jailer brings it to me," Thomas corrects. "I pay him 4 pennies per day for the bucket. I charge each of you 1 penny per day for excess. That's my business. That's how I survive 3 months in here. You want water? You pay. You don't pay? You don't drink. Simple."
Robert doesn't have the pennies to pay. He spent his last 2 on straw, which means he's now in debt to Thomas for water he's already consumed and can't pay for, which means he's in a deeply vulnerable position 3 days into his imprisonment, with no trial date set and no idea how long he'll be here. Thomas doesn't seem particularly angry about the debt, just resigned. "You can work it off," he suggests. "I need someone to empty the waste bucket twice daily, worth half a penny per day. You do that for 4 days, and we're even on the water debt. Then you keep doing it, and you earn enough to keep drinking. Fair?" It's not fair. It's extortion. It's charging Robert for access to water that should be a basic human right, then forcing him to perform degrading labor to pay for that access. But Robert doesn't have leverage to negotiate. He needs water. He can't afford to pay cash, so he accepts the arrangement, becomes Thomas's employee within the economy of the prison cell, working to pay for the privilege of not dying of thirst. The waste bucket is exactly as awful as it sounds. 5 men using 1 bucket for all elimination needs. The bucket is emptied by carrying it to a pit in the manor's grounds, dumping it, rinsing the bucket with water from a well, carrying it back. It's humiliating work, physically disgusting, and worth exactly half a penny per day in the prison economy that Thomas has established. Robert empties the bucket twice on his 4th day, earns his half-penny, drinks water without technically increasing his debt, tries not to think about the fact that he's paying for water by carrying human waste while imprisoned for stealing food he needed to survive. The irony isn't lost on him. The justice system locked him up for theft and then created conditions where he has to pay for basic needs, which would require him to steal if he had any opportunity, which he doesn't because he's locked in a cell where the only available economy is the one Thomas controls. On the 5th day, Robert learns about the other costs. Food is provided by the manor, thin gruel twice daily, enough to keep you alive, but not enough to feel satisfied. If you want more food, bread, cheese, occasionally meat, you can buy it from the jailer, at prices significantly higher than outside the prison, because where else are you going to shop? The jailer has a monopoly on food sales to captive customers, who have no negotiating power. It's the perfect market for price gouging. Robert can't afford additional food. He eats the gruel. It's mostly water with occasional grain floating in it, flavored with what might be vegetables, or might be vegetables that died several weeks ago. He's hungry constantly. But hunger is just another cost of imprisonment that you pay with your body when you don't have coins to pay with your purse. Clothing is another expense. Robert came to prison wearing his only set of clothes. After 6 days, they're already deteriorating. The cell is damp,
The stone walls sweat moisture constantly. Nothing ever fully dries. His shirt is developing holes. His trousers are stained beyond recognition. If he stays here much longer, he'll need new clothing, which the jailer will sell him at prices that would make outside merchants blush.
The blanket situation is particularly cruel. Winter is coming. The cell has no heat source. It gets cold at night, cold enough that Robert can see his breath. Blankets are available for rent, not purchase, rent at 2 pennies per night. You can't buy a blanket outright because that would reduce the jailer's ongoing revenue stream. You can only rent one, returning it each morning to be rented to someone else or to someone in a different cell. It's a business model that maximizes extraction of money from people who have essentially no money.
Robert realizes with growing horror that imprisonment isn't just about losing freedom. It's about being trapped in an economic system designed to extract every penny from you and then keep you in debt when the pennies run out. The prison economy doesn't want you to be able to pay your way. It wants you to be perpetually indebted, perpetually working off costs you can never quite cover, perpetually desperate enough to accept any arrangement that keeps you from dying.
Thomas explains this to him on the 6th day. They're sitting against the wall, sharing the thin layer of straw that Robert can no longer afford to replace. Thomas has been in the cell for 6 weeks of his 3-month sentence. He's learned how everything works, knows all the prices, understands all the angles.
The jailer makes more money from us than he makes from his legitimate salary, Thomas says. We're income. The longer we stay here, the more we spend. If we had trials tomorrow and got released or transported or hanged, that's revenue lost. So trials get delayed, convenient scheduling conflicts, missing witnesses, magistrate too busy with other manor business. They keep us here because we're profitable.
That can't be legal, Robert says.
It's completely legal, Thomas corrects. The jailer is allowed to charge for services rendered. We want straw, water, food, blankets, clothing. He provides them and charges fees. Nothing says those fees have to be affordable. Nothing says imprisonment includes free necessities. The law assumes families will provide support. If you don't have family with money, well, that's your problem.
Robert's family are tenant farmers, poor, struggling to survive themselves. They can't send money to support him in prison. He's alone in here with 3 pennies spent, 0 pennies remaining, and a growing debt to Thomas for water he's consuming and can't pay for. His trial might be weeks away. He could be here for months, and every day costs money he doesn't have.
That's when Thomas offers him the second job. I need someone to handle negotiations with new prisoners, explain the economy, set up their payment plans, make sure they understand the situation before they accumulate too much debt. You could do this, worth a penny per day, plus you keep 10% of whatever payments you collect. Interested? It's a promotion within the prison economy, from waste bucket carrier to debt collector and economic educator. Robert would be working for Thomas, but earning enough to cover his water costs, and maybe, eventually, save enough for straw or food or some other small comfort. It's collaboration with a system he finds morally repugnant, but it's also survival. And Robert is discovering that moral principles become flexible when you're cold and hungry and sleeping on stone.
He accepts, becomes Thomas's assistant in running the cell's economy, and he's good at it. When a new prisoner arrives on the 7th day, a man accused of assault, young and scared and completely ignorant of what he's walking into, Robert explains the situation with clarity and a gentleness that Thomas lacks, explains the costs, the debt structure, the work opportunities, makes the prison economy sound almost reasonable, almost fair,
almost like something other than systematic exploitation of captive people who have no alternatives.
The new prisoner, whose name is John, has 4 pennies. Robert helps him understand that 4 pennies buys maybe 4 days of basic survival, if he's very careful, that he needs to find work immediately to extend that. That working for Thomas is the best option available, because it's the only option available. John agrees to empty the waste bucket for half a penny per day. Robert has just recruited his replacement for that job, moving himself up in the economic hierarchy by finding someone more desperate to take his place.
This is how the prison economy functions. Everyone is exploiting everyone below them in the hierarchy, while being exploited by everyone above them. Thomas exploits Robert and John. Robert exploits John by managing his transition into debt. The jailer exploits Thomas by selling water at inflated prices. The magistrate exploits the jailer by allowing this entire system to operate in exchange for a cut of the profits. Everyone is complicit. Everyone is victimized. Everyone is guilty, except in the eyes of a justice system that treats this whole arrangement as perfectly normal.
Robert finds himself thinking about this late at night when he can't sleep because he's cold and the straw is too thin and someone else is snoring and the waste bucket is starting to smell because John hasn't emptied it yet. He's imprisoned for stealing chickens worth maybe 6 pennies. He's already spent more than that just trying to survive imprisonment. The punishment costs more than the crime, and that cost is being extracted not through official fines, but through this informal economy that operates with official sanction.
The quiet justice of it is what bothers him most. Nobody's screaming about injustice. Nobody's protesting the system. It's all very calm, very orderly, very much presented as just the way things work. The jailer isn't cruel, he's entrepreneurial. Thomas isn't extorting people, he's providing services. Robert isn't betraying principles, he's adapting to reality. The language sanitizes what's happening, makes exploitation sound like commerce, makes suffering sound like inconvenience.
But Robert is learning what survival means in contexts where every necessity is commodified and you have no money. Survival means compromising, means participating in systems you despise, because not participating means dying, means becoming part of the machinery of exploitation, because being outside that machinery means being its victim, with no agency at all. Robert hates it, hates himself for accepting it, hates everyone who created this system. But he keeps working for Thomas, because the alternative is thirst and starvation, and sleeping on bare stone until his trial finally happens, or he dies of the various diseases that sweep through overcrowded prison cells with no sanitation.
2 weeks into his imprisonment, Robert has become essential to the cell's economy. He manages new arrivals, tracks debts, collects payments, negotiates work arrangements. He's no longer the desperate new prisoner begging for straw. He's middle management in a system that's grinding him down just like everyone else, but at least giving him enough to survive while it does so. He earns maybe 2 pennies per day now, enough for water and thin straw and occasionally extra food. Not enough for blankets or new clothing or any real comfort, but enough to not be dying quite as fast.
The cell has a turnover. Some prisoners get tried and released, or convicted and moved to county jails for longer sentences. New prisoners arrive constantly. The population fluctuates between 4 and 7 people in a space meant for 2. Robert processes them all, explains the economy, sets up their exploitation, collects his percentage, hates himself a little more each time.
Thomas treats him almost like a partner now, shares information about how the system works at higher levels. The jailer, Garrett, pays the magistrate a monthly fee for the privilege of running the prison economy. In exchange, the magistrate ensures trials are delayed, keeps the cells full, looks the other way when prisoners complain about prices. It's corruption, but it's systematic corruption, organized corruption, the kind that operates in daylight because everyone with power benefits and everyone without power has no recourse.
You could do what I'm doing, Thomas suggests one evening. They're sharing the last of some bread Robert bought from Garrett at inflated prices. Take over when I leave. Run the economy yourself. You're better at it than I ever was. Better at talking to people. Better at making them feel like they chose this, instead of being forced into it.
I don't want to run this, Robert says.
Nobody wants to, Thomas agrees, but someone will. If not you, then whoever's strongest or cruelest or most desperate. At least if you do it, you'll be reasonable. I've seen what happens when violent men run cell economies. It's worse, much worse.
Robert doesn't want to imagine worse. This is already bad enough, but he knows Thomas is right. Someone will run the economy. It might as well be someone who feels guilty about it, rather than someone who enjoys it. 3 weeks into his imprisonment, Robert's trial finally happens. It takes 15 minutes. The magistrate finds him guilty of theft, sentences him to 2 months in prison, plus a fine of 1 shilling, which is 12 pennies. Robert has maybe 4 pennies saved from his work in the cell economy. He owes the other 8 pennies, which means he's not leaving prison when his sentence ends. He'll stay imprisoned until the fine is paid, which means more participation in the economy, more work for Thomas or whoever takes over when Thomas leaves, more days of trading labor for water and straw and the basic necessities of staying alive.
The sentence feels less like justice and more like business development. The magistrate just extended Robert's stay, which means extended revenue for the prison economy, which means extended fees paid to the magistrate. Everyone profits except Robert. He's the commodity being traded here. His needs, his labor, his continued captivity, all of it has value to everyone except him.
He returns to the cell after his trial, and Thomas is sympathetic. Same thing happened to me. They fine you amounts you can't pay, keep you here longer. It's how the system sustains itself. You'll work it off eventually, or your family will send money, or you'll find some angle I haven't thought of. You'll survive.
Survival. That's the constant refrain. Not justice or rehabilitation or any of the supposedly noble purposes of imprisonment. Just survival. Just continuing to exist despite a system designed to extract everything from you. Just finding ways to pay for water and straw and the basic requirements of not dying while locked in a cell where everything costs money and you have none.
Robert starts his 2-month sentence already exhausted by 3 weeks of adaptation to prison economics, already compromised by his participation in exploiting newcomers, already aware that this is all perfectly legal and perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable to everyone except the people it's destroying. He's learning what quiet justice means, justice that operates without spectacle, without drama, without obvious cruelty, just the steady, grinding extraction of value from people who have nothing until they're used up completely and the system moves on to the next batch of prisoners who'll go through the same process.
The straw still costs 2 pennies per handful. The water still costs a penny per day. The waste bucket still needs emptying. And Robert still participates because survival requires it. That's what the prison economy teaches. That's what the manor cells reveal about justice. That when punishment becomes profit, survival becomes currency, and most people don't have enough.
Thomas leaves after 7 weeks. His sentence is complete.
He's paid his debt to society, such as it was. He's also made approximately 30 shillings profit from running the cell economy during his incarceration, which is more than many labourers earn in 3 months of legitimate work. He shakes Robert's hand before departing, offers unsolicited advice about maintaining price stability and avoiding violence, and walks out of the cell a wealthier man than when he walked in. Justice served.
Robert inherits the prison economy by default. Nobody else wants it. The other prisoners, currently 5 of them in the 8 by 10-foot cell, are either too broken to organise, too violent to be trusted with power, or too new to understand how the system works. Robert is the obvious choice, despite his own misgivings. He knows the prices, knows the relationships, knows how to manage Garrett, the jailer, and the flow of new prisoners, and the delicate balance between extracting enough money to pay his own costs while not pushing people into desperate enough circumstances that they riot or die.
He negotiates with Garrett directly now, buys the water bucket for 4 pennies per day, same as Thomas did, charges each prisoner 1 penny per day for access. The markup isn't excessive. It's basically just covering the cost of administration and the risk that someone won't pay. Robert tells himself this makes him reasonable, better than he could be, better than many people would be in his position. He's still charging desperate people for water, but at least he's not gouging them.
The straw business is more complicated. Garrett sells straw by the armful for 6 pennies. 1 armful can be divided into maybe 4 handfuls. Robert buys 1 armful per week, sells the handfuls for 2 pennies each. That's 8 pennies revenue on 6 pennies cost. 2 pennies profit per week from selling mouldy straw to people who need something between themselves and the stone floor. It's barely worth the effort, except that small profits accumulate. Robert is learning what Thomas already knew. The prison economy works through volume and consistency, small margins multiplied by desperate need and captive customers.
He expands the services, starts negotiating with Garrett for better food than the standard gruel, buys bread at 2 pennies per loaf, divides each loaf into 6 portions, sells each portion for 1 penny. That's 6 pennies revenue on 2 pennies cost, 4 pennies profit per loaf. Robert buys 3 loaves per week, 12 pennies profit. He's becoming a merchant, a prison merchant, trading necessities to people who literally cannot go elsewhere for better prices or better goods.
The blanket rental system is the most lucrative and the most morally compromising. Winter has arrived. The cell is freezing at night. Breath mists. Water in the bucket develops ice on the surface by morning. People will pay anything for warmth. Garrett has 6 blankets available for the cell. He charges Robert 12 pennies per week for exclusive rental rights to all 6. Robert rents them out at 2 pennies per night per person. On any given night with 5 prisoners in the cell, that's 10 pennies revenue. 70 pennies per week, minus the 12 paid to Garrett, 58 pennies profit per week, just from blankets.
Robert is making more money in prison than he ever made outside it. That realization sits uncomfortably. He's profiting from captivity, extracting wealth from people whose only crime in most cases is being poor and making poor decisions. He's become exactly what he despised when Thomas was running things. The only difference is he feels guilty about it, which doesn't actually help anyone, but makes him feel slightly less monstrous.
The guilt doesn't stop him from expanding further. He starts taking commissions. If a prisoner wants something specific that Garrett doesn't normally supply, Robert can arrange it for a fee. Better clothing, writing materials, specific foods, information about trials or legal processes. Anything that can be commodified becomes part of the economy. Robert takes 10% of the value as his commission, sometimes more if they're particularly difficult or if he senses the prisoner can afford it.
This is where the favor economy emerges. Not everything can be paid in coin.
Some prisoners have no money at all. Some are too indebted to ever pay off what they owe. But they have other things to trade. Labor, obviously, but also information, connections, skills. Robert starts accepting alternative currencies. A prisoner who can read and write offers to teach others in exchange for credit towards his water debt. Another who knows medicinal herbs offers to treat minor injuries and illnesses for straw and blankets. A third who has connections outside the prison offers to get messages delivered to families in exchange for food.
The economy becomes more sophisticated, more complex, less about direct cash transactions and more about a network of reciprocal obligations and value exchanges. Robert keeps track of it all in his head. Who owes whom? Who's paid up? Who's falling behind? Who needs pressure to pay and who needs grace to avoid breaking? It's a constant calculation, a constant negotiation between maximizing revenue and maintaining enough humanity that the system doesn't collapse into violence.
If you just felt that discomfort, like watching someone become what they hate while telling themselves it's necessary, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way systems compromise the people within them, the way survival requires participation in exploitation, that's the core of how power actually works. Subscribe if you want more of these moments where moral complexity becomes impossible to escape.
The violence comes anyway. A prisoner named William has been in the cell for 3 weeks. He's accumulated significant debt, owes Robert 8 pennies for water and straw and blankets he's used but can't afford. Robert has been patient because William is awaiting trial for debt, which means he's imprisoned for not having money, which makes charging him more money particularly cruel. But patience has limits. The system requires payment. Even Robert's compassionate version of it requires payment eventually.
Robert approaches William on a Monday morning, explains that the debt needs to be addressed, offers the standard options: work it off through labor, find someone outside who can send money, trade something of value. William has no labor to offer that isn't already spoken for, has no connections outside, has nothing to trade, which leaves the final option that Robert hates discussing, but sometimes becomes necessary.
You can transfer the debt, Robert says quietly. They're in the corner of the cell where conversations can be semi-private. I know people who buy prison debts. They pay me half of what you owe them the full amount. They collect after you're released. It's expensive, but it clears your debt here.
William understands what this means. He'd be trading prison debt for debt to people who collect through methods significantly more violent than Robert's system of water rationing and blanket denial. He'd be free of obligation in the cell, but enslaved to worse obligations outside. The debt buyers are criminals who use prison cells as recruitment grounds. They buy debts cheap, collect them dear, and destroy people who can't pay. Robert knows this. William knows this. The transfer option is technically available, but practically it's selling William into a different kind of imprisonment.
William refuses. I'll work it off. I'll do whatever needs doing. Just don't transfer the debt.
There's no work available, Robert says. Everyone who can work is already working. I can't create jobs that don't exist.
Then let me go hungry. Let me go without blankets. I'll survive on gruel and stone floor until my trial. Just don't sell my debt.
It's a reasonable request. Robert agrees to it, cuts off William's access to everything except the bare minimum the manor provides. William will suffer, but he won't be enslaved to criminals. It's the best outcome available in a situation where all outcomes are terrible. Robert tells himself he's being merciful, which is true relative to the alternatives. Still doesn't feel particularly merciful when he watches William shiver through cold nights without blankets, while Robert profits from renting those blankets to others.
The incident with William makes Robert reconsider the entire operation. He's running a business that trades human suffering for profit. That's not an exaggeration or rhetorical flourish. That's the literal mechanics of the prison economy. People suffer without straw, water, blankets, food. Robert reduces suffering in exchange for payment. The reduction is real. The payment is real. The underlying business model is monetizing relief from suffering he's not directly causing, but is definitely positioned to mitigate for a fee.
He could run the operation at cost, charge only what Garrett charges him. No markup, no profit, just pass-through pricing that covers expenses. That would be more ethical, less exploitative. It would also mean Robert earns nothing from his time managing the economy, which means he can't pay his own fine, which means he can't ever leave prison. The system is designed such that managing the economy requires profit, because managers need money to pay for their own survival and eventual release. You can't run the prison economy charitably without trapping yourself in prison indefinitely.
That's the elegance of it from the magistrate's perspective. The system recruits its own administrators from among the prisoners, motivates them with the possibility of earning their way out, ensures they extract maximum revenue because their own freedom depends on it. Nobody has to force Robert to maximize profits. His own self-interest does that. The quiet justice of it is that the system makes victims complicit in their own exploitation and the exploitation of others, makes them both perpetrator and victim simultaneously, eliminates clear villains because everyone is trapped in roles the system assigned them. Robert continues running the economy because he has no alternative, but he modifies his approach slightly, extends more grace to prisoners who can't pay, offers longer timelines for debt repayment, creates more opportunities for non-monetary exchange. It's still exploitation, but he's trying to make it exploitation with a human face, extraction with compassion, which might be more morally complicated than just being straightforwardly cruel, but it's the compromise Robert can live with.
The magistrate notices the reduced profit. The monthly payment that Garrett makes to the magistrate, Robert's learned the amount, 10% of gross prison economy revenue, has declined slightly. Not dramatically. Robert is still profitable, still generating decent income for everyone upstream. But the decline is noticeable enough that the magistrate summons Garrett, who summons Robert. They meet in Garrett's quarters, adjacent to the cells. It's the first time Robert has been outside the cell in 7 weeks. The contrast is jarring. Garrett's room is warm, clean, furnished with actual furniture. It smells like bread and ale instead of human waste and mold. Robert stands in the doorway, feeling acutely aware of his own degradation. He's covered in grime, wearing clothes that are falling apart, smelling of the cell, standing in front of 2 men who profit from his imprisonment, and asking him to explain why profits have declined.
"You're being too generous," Garrett says bluntly. "Thomas never had this problem. He charged market rates, enforced debt aggressively, kept revenue steady. You're cutting deals, extending credit, letting prisoners run up debts they'll never repay. That's charity. We're not running a charity."
"I'm keeping people alive," Robert says. "If I squeeze them harder, they'll die. Dead prisoners don't pay debts, don't generate revenue. I'm maximizing long-term profit by maintaining survivable conditions."
It's a lie. Robert is being more generous than necessary for profit maximization, but the argument is framed in language Garrett understands. Revenue, profit, long-term thinking. Robert has learned to speak the language of exploitation fluently enough to justify compassion in economic terms. Garrett considers this. He's not stupid. He knows Robert is lying. But the lie is convenient, allows Garrett to maintain pressure for profits while giving Robert cover to be slightly less monstrous. Fine, But the revenue needs to increase, not decrease. Figure it out. You've got management skills, use them.
Robert returns to the cell with a mandate to extract more. He implements it by expanding the economy rather than raising prices. Starts offering gambling. Prisoners can bet on various outcomes, trial verdicts, new prisoner arrival dates, even weather. Robert takes a cut of all bets as the house. It's pure profit. No costs except the labour of tracking bets and paying winners. And prisoners gamble compulsively because they're bored and desperate and hoping for lucky breaks that will change their circumstances.
The gambling generates significant revenue, more than Robert expected. Desperate people make irrational financial decisions. They bet pennies they need for water on outcomes they can't predict or control. They lose consistently because the house has advantages and because Robert isn't running a fair gambling operation. He's running a profit centre that happens to look like gambling. The revenue increases. Garrett is satisfied. The magistrate's cut goes back up. Everyone upstream profits from prisoner desperation.
Robert hates it. Hates what he's become. Hates what the system makes him do. But he's also close to paying off his fine. Another 3 weeks and he'll have earned enough to pay the 8 pennies he owes, plus a bit extra for his own survival until he's released. 3 more weeks of running an economy he despises. 3 more weeks of exploiting people who have nothing. 3 more weeks of compromising his principles for survival. It's finite. That's what he tells himself. It's finite exploitation with a clear end date when he walks out of here and never has to think about prison economics again.
Then a new prisoner arrives who changes everything. Her name is Catherine. She's being held awaiting trial for witchcraft, which is insane because it's 1678 and England has mostly moved past witchcraft hysteria. But apparently local superstition is strong enough that someone accused her and the magistrate is taking it seriously. She's 35 years old, a widow, has no money, no connections, no resources, except an extensive knowledge of herbal medicine and a refusal to be intimidated by the cell conditions.
Catherine takes one look at the prison economy and starts competing with it. She offers free medical treatment for injuries and illnesses that Robert charges for. She teaches literacy and numeracy for free to prisoners who want to learn. She shares her food with others who are hungry. She's running a counter-economy based on mutual aid rather than profit, and prisoners respond enthusiastically. They still have to pay Robert for water and straw and blankets because those are monopoly goods he controls through Garrett. But everything else that Robert commodified, information, skills, comfort, Catherine provides for free.
Robert's profits decline. Not catastrophically. The monopoly goods still generate revenue, but the discretionary spending decreases as prisoners choose Catherine's free services over Robert's paid ones. He's losing market share to someone running a competing business model based on principles he used to share before imprisonment forced him to abandon them.
He should shut her down. That's what Thomas would have done. That's what Garrett expects. Use violence or threats or manipulation to eliminate the competition, restore the monopoly, maximize profits. But Robert can't bring himself to do it. Catherine is doing what he wishes he could do, operating on principles he respects, providing real help to people who need it without extracting payment. She's what he should be and isn't.
So he lets it continue, accepts the reduced revenue, takes the criticism from Garrett, and watches as the cell dynamic changes. Prisoners start helping each other more, start sharing resources, start behaving like a community instead of like isolated individuals competing for scarce goods. Catherine didn't just introduce competition. She introduced an alternative to the entire economic model, showed that cooperation is possible even in conditions designed to force competition. showed that survival doesn't require exploitation if people choose solidarity instead.
It's idealistic, naive, won't last. Robert knows this. The system is stronger than Catherine's principles. Eventually the conditions will grind her down, or new prisoners will arrive who aren't interested in mutual aid, or Garrett will intervene to protect his revenue stream. But while it lasts, it's remarkable. A glimpse of what might be possible if the prison economy wasn't designed to profit from suffering.
Robert pays off his fine after 9 weeks, has the 8 pennies plus a bit extra, presents it to Garrett, expects to be released, is instead told he needs to pay an additional exit fee, 2 shillings, 24 pennies, to cover the administrative costs of processing his release. This wasn't mentioned at sentencing, wasn't part of the fine structure. It's just another extraction point in a system designed to have infinite extraction points.
Robert doesn't have 24 pennies, has maybe 3 pennies remaining after paying the fine, which means he's not leaving, which means he needs to continue running the prison economy, continue exploiting people, continue compromising. The freedom he thought he'd earned is actually still 21 pennies away. The system moved the goalposts, made sure he couldn't escape even after meeting all the stated requirements.
That night, Robert has a conversation with Catherine. They're in the corner where semi-private conversations happen. Other prisoners are sleeping, or trying to sleep, despite the cold and the smell, and the general misery of existence in the cell.
The system doesn't want you to leave, Catherine observes. It makes money from your presence, your management skills, your willingness to do what's necessary to survive. You're valuable here. Free, you're just another poor person struggling. Imprisoned, you're generating revenue for multiple people upstream.
I didn't ask to be valuable to them, Robert says.
None of us asked for any of this, but here we are. You can keep playing their game, keep trying to earn enough to satisfy requirements they'll keep changing, or you can choose something different.
Like what? Refuse to manage the economy? Someone worse will take over. Refuse to pay the fees? Stay imprisoned forever. There are no good choices. There's always another choice, Catherine says. It might not be comfortable, might not be safe, but it exists. You've just gotten used to thinking in their terms, used to accepting that survival requires exploitation, used to measuring success by how much money you accumulate. What if you measured it differently?
Robert doesn't have an answer. He's too tired, too worn down by weeks of moral compromise and physical degradation, too trapped in thinking that Catherine is right to criticize, but wrong to think there are actually alternatives available. The prison economy has taught him that survival requires participation in exploitation, that freedom requires accumulating money through methods you despise, that justice is just business conducted through the language of punishment. And he can't see past that teaching to whatever different vision Catherine is trying to articulate.
The next morning, a prisoner dies. His name was Edmund. He'd been in the cell for 6 weeks, couldn't pay for blankets, couldn't afford extra food, developed a cough that turned into pneumonia that killed him because he was cold and malnourished and sleeping on stone floors in a damp cell with no medical care except what Catherine could provide with limited resources. The death is ruled natural causes. Nobody investigates whether the conditions were survivable. Nobody questions whether charging prisoners for necessities creates death traps. Nobody suggests that perhaps imprisonment shouldn't be structured as a profit center that makes survival contingent on having money you almost certainly don't have.
Edmund's death is just another data point, another cost of doing business. The cell gets cleaned, the body removed. A new prisoner arrives the same day to take Edmund's place. The economy continues. Robert continues running it.
The profits continue flowing upstream. Nothing changes except Robert's growing certainty that he's participating in something that quietly kills people while calling itself justice, and his growing doubt that there's any way out that doesn't require him to keep participating until it eventually kills him too.
Edmund's death forces Robert to make a choice he's been avoiding for weeks. He can continue running the prison economy, accumulating pennies towards an exit fee that might keep increasing, participating in a system that kills people through systematic deprivation. Or he can stop, accept that he'll be imprisoned indefinitely, let someone else take over, who will probably be worse, give up on freedom defined as earning enough money to buy release from a system designed to never quite let you buy your way out.
Catherine doesn't pressure him, doesn't lecture, just treats Edmund's death as what it is, evidence that the system is murderous, and participation in that system has consequences measured in bodies. She continues running her mutual aid counter-economy, sharing food, teaching skills, providing medical care, operating as if solidarity is possible even here, even in conditions specifically structured to make solidarity impossible.
Robert watches her for 3 days, watches prisoners gravitating toward her model instead of his, watches the cell become slightly less hellish despite unchanged physical conditions, watches people help each other, not because they're being paid, but because the alternative is letting each other die like Edmund died. It's not sustainable long-term. Robert knows this. The scarcity is real. The costs imposed by Garrett are real. You can't run a mutual aid economy when basic necessities require payment to external authorities who don't care about solidarity or community. But it's working temporarily, providing proof that different approaches are possible.
On the 4th day after Edmund's death, Robert makes his decision. He stops charging for water. Just stops, tells prisoners they can drink freely, takes the 4-penny daily loss himself, can't afford it long-term, but can afford it for now using his accumulated savings. He's deliberately destroying his own profit margin to provide one basic necessity for free.
Garrett notices within a week, summons Robert again. This time the conversation is less polite. You're running a charity. Again, we discussed this. Revenue must increase, not disappear. You're costing me money, costing the magistrate money. This stops now, or someone else runs the economy.
Then someone else runs it, Robert says. I'm done.
He means it. He's been managing the prison economy for 12 weeks, has accumulated maybe 30 pennies toward the 24 he needs for the exit fee. Would take another few weeks to finish paying it if he kept maximizing profits, but he's not going to. Edmund's death broke something in him, some willingness to keep compromising, keep participating, keep telling himself that exploitation with a human face is better than alternatives that don't actually exist because someone will always exploit, and it might as well be someone who feels bad about it.
Garrett replaces him immediately. A prisoner named Richard takes over. Richard is everything Robert tried not to be. Cruel, aggressive, maximally extractive. He restores prices to what Thomas charged, eliminates the grace periods Robert offered, enforces debts violently, starts using physical intimidation to ensure payment. Within days, the cell becomes more brutal, more desperate. Prisoners who struggled under Robert's management are failing completely under Richard's, and Richard doesn't care. He's optimizing for profit, extracting maximum revenue, running the prison economy exactly as it was designed to be run, without Robert's inconvenient morality getting in the way.
Catherine's mutual aid model collapses almost immediately. Richard sees it as competition, uses his control over water to shut it down. Either participate in his economy or don't drink. Simple, brutal, effective. Catherine can't run mutual aid if people need to pay Richard for water before they can survive long enough to benefit from her free services. The economic model wins, the solidarity model fails. Robert watches it happen with something between despair and vindication. He was right that it wouldn't last, right that the system is stronger, right that someone worse would take over. Being right feels terrible.
Robert stops participating in the economy entirely. Drinks water because Richard can't realistically deny it without prisoners dying too obviously for the magistrate to ignore. Eats the provided gruel. Sleeps on stone floor without straw. Freezes at night without blankets. Goes without everything except bare minimum survival. His accumulated pennies, 33 after 12 weeks of managing the economy, sit useless because he's still 9 pennies short of the exit fee and has no way to earn more without managing the economy he just quit.
He's trapped himself deliberately, chosen imprisonment without end date rather than continued participation in exploitation. It's principled, noble even, also completely impractical. He's going to die here, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, the way Edmund died, through accumulated deprivation that eventually overcomes physical resilience and kills you while everyone calls it natural causes.
Catherine sits with him one evening after Richard has rented all the blankets to prisoners who can afford them, leaving Robert and 2 others to shiver through the night. "You chose correctly," she says. "This will sound insane to say while we're freezing on stone floors, but you chose correctly. Better to die refusing than live complicit."
"I'm not sure dying is better," Robert says. "Seems like the system wins either way. Kills me for resisting or kills me for participating. Just different time frames."
The system doesn't win when you refuse it. The system wants your participation, wants you managing the economy, wants you exploiting others so it doesn't have to directly show its cruelty. Richard is worse than you, but also more obviously cruel. Prisoners can see what the system is through Richard in ways they couldn't through you. You were making the system bearable. That's what it wanted. Richard is making it unbearable. That's dangerous for them. Robert doesn't understand what Catherine means until the riot happens 3 weeks later. Not a dramatic, explosive riot, just a refusal. Prisoners stop paying Richard, all of them simultaneously. Stop paying for water, for straw, for blankets, for everything, except that they'll suffer but refuse to participate in the economy that's killing them. It's collective action, organized resistance, something that wasn't possible under Robert's management, because Robert made the system just functional enough that individuals could survive by participating. Richard made it so brutal that collective refusal became the better option.
The riot lasts 2 days. Garrett intervenes with violence. Several prisoners are beaten, moved to isolation cells. The resistance is crushed. Richard remains in charge. The economy continues, but something has changed. The prisoners understand now that the system requires their participation, that without them choosing to engage with the economy, trading their pennies for basic necessities, the whole structure collapses. They can't sustain refusal long term. The scarcity is real. The violence is real. But they've proven that the system needs them more than they need the system. That power flows from their willingness to participate, not from Richard's control over resources. Catherine dies 4 weeks after the riot, not from violence, from illness, pneumonia like Edmund. She couldn't afford blankets under Richard's economy, couldn't pay for the water that might have kept her hydrated enough to fight the infection. Died on stone floors in a damp cell while Richard rented blankets to prisoners who could pay. Her last words to Robert are about solidarity, about how resistance means refusing to accept that survival requires exploitation, about how dying free matters more than living complicit. Robert isn't sure he believes her,
but he respects that she believed it enough to die for it.
Her death radicalizes him, not toward violence, toward refusal on a deeper level. He stops thinking about earning his exit fee, stops thinking about eventual release, starts thinking about how to make the prison economy impossible to operate, how to undermine it from within, even without managing it, how to sabotage a system that's designed to profit from suffering.
He starts by sharing information, teaching prisoners how the economy works, not just the prices, but the underlying structure. Who gets paid what? How money flows from prisoners to Richard, to Garrett, to the magistrate. Making the exploitation visible, showing people that their pennies aren't just buying water and straw. They're funding a system where everyone upstream profits from their misery. Once prisoners understand the full picture, some start refusing payments, even knowing it means suffering. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to impact revenue.
Richard responds with violence, beats prisoners who don't pay, withholds water for days, uses tactics that Robert specifically avoided because they're obviously cruel. But the cruelty becomes evidence, becomes something prisoners can point to when family members visit, when magistrates occasionally inspect the cells. The quiet justice that worked through Robert's management, exploitation, presented as reasonable commerce, suffering presented as inevitable post of imprisonment, stops being quiet under Richard, becomes loud, visible, undeniable.
Thank you for spending this time with me exploring prison economies and what they reveal about justice, exploitation, and survival. If this story changed how you think about incarceration, about how systems monetize suffering, about the choices people make when all options are terrible, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. What surprised you about these economics? Where do you see similar systems today? What does this tell us about how punishment becomes profit? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your reflections on these questions.
The magistrate eventually shuts down the prison economy, not because of morality, because the protests and complaints have become too visible. Too many family members asking why their imprisoned relatives are being beaten. Too many bodies like Edmund and Catherine dying of conditions that look suspiciously like systematic neglect. The quiet justice only works when it stays quiet. Richard made it loud, made it obvious that prisoners are being exploited and sometimes killed for profit. The magistrate can't ignore that without risking his own position.
The shutdown means Garrett loses revenue. Richard loses his position. The prison economy stops operating as organized extraction and becomes something else. Prisoners still need straw and blankets and extra food, but now those items are provided at cost. No markup, no profit, just actual expenses passed through without enriching anyone. It's not charity. It's not even particularly humane, but it's less actively murderous than what came before.
Robert serves 23 weeks total before the exit fee is quietly waived. Not officially, just forgotten. He's released along with several other prisoners whose fees are equally forgiven. The magistrate is clearing house, getting rid of prisoners who've been causing problems, stealing chickens worth 6 pennies, having learned more about justice and economics and survival than he wanted to know.
He's changed, obviously. 5 months in conditions that range from brutal to slightly less brutal leaves marks. Physical marks. He's thinner, weaker, sick with something respiratory that will take months to recover from. And psychological marks. Understanding that justice is just business conducted through the language of punishment. That survival often requires compromise. That systems are stronger than individuals, but vulnerable to collective action. That the powerful want quiet exploitation, and resistance means making exploitation loud.
Robert spends the next decade thinking about what he learned in Blackstone's cells, writes about it occasionally in letters to people who care about prison reform, doesn't publish, doesn't organize, just documents, records what the prison economy was, how it worked, who profited, how it killed people while operating completely legally and with full official sanction. His documentation survives, gets discovered by historians centuries later, who are astonished that someone in 1678 understood prison economics clearly enough to describe systematic exploitation in terms that remain relevant 300 years later.
Because the prison economy didn't end with Blackstone Manor in 1678. Variations of it continue through the 18th century, the 19th century, into the 20th. Manor prisons become county jails, become modern correctional facilities, and the core economic model remains remarkably consistent. Charge inmates for basic necessities, create internal markets where everything costs money, allow some inmates to profit from others, extract wealth from people who have almost no wealth, while calling it justice and rehabilitation and public safety.
The specifics change. Modern prisons don't usually charge for water, but they charge for phone calls, for medical care, for decent food, for educational materials, for virtually everything except the bare minimum required to technically keep people alive. The straw costs 2 pennies. The phone call home costs $5. The inflation-adjusted price is similar. The underlying logic is identical. Find people who can't leave, who need basic things, who have limited resources. Charge them for those things. Call it fair because technically they're choosing to purchase rather than going without.
The trade of favors for coin continues too. Modern prison economies have complex systems of debt, obligation, and alternative currency. Commissary becomes the equivalent of Robert's straw and blanket rental. Jobs within the prison become the equivalent of managing the water bucket. The hierarchy of who has access to resources and who has to work for access replicates in different contexts with different specifics but identical structure. Some inmates become managers, some become workers, some become debtors who never escape obligation. The roles persist across centuries because the incentives persist. The system wants prisoners to manage other prisoners, wants them participating in their own exploitation, wants quiet justice where suffering happens through economic mechanisms that seem voluntary.
Robert's documentation includes this observation. The genius of the prison economy is that it eliminates rebellion by making survival contingent on participation. You cannot resist a system you depend on for basic necessities. You cannot organize against people you're indebted to. You cannot imagine alternatives when all your energy goes toward earning enough to drink water and sleep on straw instead of stone. The system doesn't crush resistance through violence. It crushes resistance through exhaustion, through making every day a calculation about how to survive until tomorrow, through ensuring that rebellion means death, while cooperation means merely suffering.
He's writing in 1685, 7 years after his release. He's working as a clerk in a merchant's house, living modestly, never been imprisoned again. But the experience stays with him, shapes how he sees every economic relationship, every power dynamic, every situation where some people have what others need and can charge accordingly. The prison economy taught him to recognize exploitation wherever it exists, taught him that systems that seem normal and reasonable and just the way things work are often quietly extractive, taught him that survival sometimes requires refusal, even when refusal is dangerous.
The habits he developed in prison persist. He's careful with money, never buys more than he needs, shares resources with people who have less, refuses to participate in economies where profit comes from other people's deprivation. He can't change the broader system, can't shut down the prison economies operating in manor houses throughout England, but he can choose not to personally benefit from them, can live according to principles that Catherine died asserting, can remember Edmund and the others who died because they couldn't afford blankets, while people charged rent for warmth.
The quiet rules Robert learned are lessons about how power actually works. Power wants participation more than submission, wants you to believe there are no alternatives to its terms, wants you exhausted by survival so you can't imagine resistance. The rules for surviving under power are simultaneously rules for recognizing power's vulnerabilities. When you understand that the system needs your participation, you understand that withholding participation is power you possess. When you understand that quiet exploitation depends on staying quiet, you understand that making it loud is resistance. When you understand that systems optimize for profit over human survival, you understand that choosing survival over profit is rebellion.
The threats don't end with release from prison. Robert lives the rest of his life understanding that the society he inhabits operates on prison economy principles at larger scale, that landlords charge rent like jailers charge for straw, that employers trade wages for labour like Robert traded water access for waste bucket emptying, that debt functions like the obligations prisoners accumulated to Thomas and Richard and Robert himself. The prison was just a concentrated version of broader economic relationships, made the extraction more visible because everything happened in an 8 by 10 foot cell, where you couldn't avoid seeing how basic needs become commodities when someone controls supply.
Modern readers encountering Robert's documentation are often shocked by how explicitly exploitative 17th century prison economics were. How openly the system charged for water, how brazenly jailers profited from captive populations, how clearly the magistrate participated in extracting wealth from prisoners. The lack of pretense seems almost refreshing compared to modern systems that accomplish similar extraction while using language about rehabilitation and public safety and paying debt to society.
But Robert would recognize modern prison economics immediately, would see the phone call charges as water bucket fees, would see the commissary markups as straw rental, would see the prison labor programs as the jobs prisoners work to pay for basic necessities, would understand that the quiet justice operating in 17th century manor cells is the same quiet justice operating in 21st century correctional facilities, just better branded, more bureaucratic, more carefully hidden behind language that obscures rather than reveals.
His final entry in the documentation, written in 1695, when he's 40 years old and dying of the lung disease he contracted in Blackstone's damp cells, addresses future readers directly. If you read this, wondering whether conditions are better in your time, ask yourself these questions. Do imprisoned people have to pay for basic necessities? Do some inmates profit from others? Does the system generate revenue for authorities? Do prisoners work for wages below market rate? If the answer to any of these is yes, then you have prison economies. The mechanisms might be different. The justifications might sound more sophisticated, but the underlying logic is identical. Suffering is profitable. Justice is business. Survival requires participation in exploitation, and the powerful profit while the powerless either participate or die.
He's right. Historians examining his documents in the 18th, 19th, 20th and 21st centuries confirm that prison economics persist, adapt to new technologies and new social norms, become more complex but not fundamentally different. The straw costs 2 pennies, the video call home costs $5, the commissary items cost twice what they cost outside.
The economics of captivity remain remarkably stable across 4 centuries because the incentives remain stable. Prisons are expensive to operate. Prisoners are captive markets who can't negotiate or leave. Charging prisoners for services reduces costs for authorities, while generating revenue from families who send money to support imprisoned loved ones. The math works. The ethics are terrible, but the math works. So the system persists.
Robert dies in 1695 at age 40, never married, never had children, lived modestly as a clerk. His documentation survives him, preserved in a chest of papers that eventually end up in a county archive, where historians discover them in the 1890s. The documents cause a minor sensation among prison reform advocates who use Robert's first-hand account of prison economics to argue for regulation of jailer practices and elimination of fee systems. Some reforms happen, slowly, incompletely. Many of the practices Robert documented continue through the 20th century.
His legacy is complicated. He spent 12 weeks managing a prison economy he despised, exploited people he wanted to help, made survival contingent on payment that most prisoners couldn't afford, did all the things Catherine died refusing to do. Then he spent 7 years documenting it, explaining how it worked, analyzing why it persisted, creating a record that future reformers could use to argue for change. He was both perpetrator and witness, both complicit and resistant, both part of the system and critic of the system.
That complexity is important. Easy narratives about heroes and villains miss what actually happens in systems designed to compromise everyone within them. Robert wasn't a hero who maintained perfect principles. He managed the prison economy for weeks, profited from desperation, made choices he's not proud of. But he also quit when he understood the costs, refused to continue participating, even when refusal meant suffering, documented what he'd done so others could learn from it, spent the rest of his life trying to live according to principles the prison economy taught him were both necessary and insufficient for actual justice.
The quiet justice he experienced is justice that operates through economic mechanisms rather than explicit violence, through charging for necessities rather than denying them outright, through creating choices that aren't really choices because all options are terrible, but some are less immediately lethal. It's justice that lets authorities claim they're not being cruel because technically prisoners can access what they need if they pay. Justice that makes survival a market transaction, where some people can afford it and some people can't, and the ones who can't die quietly while everyone pretends that's not the intended outcome.
That's what the Manor prison cells reveal. That's what trading straw, water, and favours for coin demonstrates. That punishment becomes profit when every necessity is commodified. That survival becomes currency when you're captive and have no choice. That systems that seem reasonable, people choosing to purchase rather than go without, are actually systematic exploitation presented in the language of free markets. That justice stops being about correction or rehabilitation or public safety and becomes about revenue generation from people who can't negotiate or leave or refuse.
Robert learned this through 5 months in an 8 by 10 foot cell where everything cost money and he had none. Learned it through managing an economy he hated. Learned it through watching people die because they couldn't afford blankets. Learned it through the quiet, grinding process of discovering that justice is just business conducted through the language of punishment, and business doesn't care if you die as long as you paid for your necessities first.
The straw still costs 2 pennies. Modern prison commissaries still charge inflated prices. Inmates still work for pennies per hour. Families still send money to support imprisoned relatives who need basics the system should provide but instead sells. The economics haven't changed. The language has gotten more sophisticated, the justifications sound more reasonable, but the underlying extraction is identical. 400 years after Robert documented the Manor prison economy, the same economic model operates in prisons worldwide. The quiet justice persists, the profiting from captivity continues, and the people experiencing it still make impossible choices about survival and complicity, and whether participating in systems you despise is better than refusing and dying.
That's the legacy. That's what the dots in margins and the straw on floors and the pennies for water add up to. A system that turned punishment into profit, made suffering into markets, created justice that operates through quiet economic extraction rather than loud dramatic cruelty. And that justice persists because it works, generates revenue, reduces official costs, operates with plausible deniability because technically prisoners are choosing to purchase rather than being denied. The quiet part is that the choice isn't real. The purchase is coerced. The denial is just deferred. And people die in prison cells because they can't afford blankets, while everyone calls it justice and moves on to the next batch of prisoners who'll go through the same process.
Robert understood this. Catherine understood this. Edmund learned it too late. The lesson remains relevant because the system remains operational. Different forms, different contexts, same extractive logic underneath. That's what Manor prison cells, trading straw, water and favours for coin, reveals about quiet justice and survival. That justice is often just another name for exploitation conducted through official channels, and survival requires understanding that so you can choose whether to participate or refuse. Neither option is good, but at least understanding the system means you're choosing consciously rather than being exploited while pretending that's not what's happening.
The economy persists. The suffering continues. The quiet justice operates in prison cells around the world, and Robert's documentation survives as testimony that it was always this way, has always been this way, will likely remain this way until people decide that justice should mean something other than making money from other people's captivity. That decision remains perpetually just out of reach, always almost possible, never quite achieved. The straw costs 2 pennies. The choice remains impossible, and the quiet justice grinds on.